maybe on the surface at the beginning, we think there's only two options for why a pastor would not talk about Charlie Kirk. Either he does talk about the assassination, and therefore he's brave, and he says the things that need to be said, and he loves truth. Or he doesn't talk about it, which means he hates truth, and he's a coward, and he's not saying the things that need to be said. But really, I think there's four options that we should consider. Welcome back. I'd call this a sunrise episode, but the sun really hasn't risen yet. It's rainy. It's also getting darker. Season's getting later. Fall's coming. That's exciting. Given the events of the past couple of weeks, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the question, if your pastor did not talk about Charlie Kirk in his sermon the week after the assassination, should you leave your church? And this is going all around on the internet. Like everybody was saying, if your pastor doesn't talk about Charlie Kirk this Sunday in his sermon, you ought to leave your church. Like so many people, thousands of people were saying that. And at first, I had a certain opinion on this. And then the more I thought about it, I kind of, as often happens, I have come to a more reasonable opinion. I think generally the obvious answer is what covers the vast majority of situations, but there are also some maybe fringe cases that I want you to consider. So if your pastor did not talk about Charlie Kirk or the assassination during Sunday, during the sermon, should you leave? So here's the basic argument, and I think it's a pretty powerful one, and that is pastors. The role of a pastor or a preacher is to say the things that the congregation needs to hear in order to guide them better in their lives from the Word of God. And so if they're preaching about something and some national tragedy happens, or even if the congregation has some kind of sin that they're dealing with, no matter what it is, if the congregation needs to hear something, then I think pastors, and this is true, have a responsibility to talk about it. If the congregation needs to be guided in a certain way, if the congregation needs to hear how to think about a certain thing that is very culturally important, that they are dealing with, then the pastor should say something. Absolutely, because it's their job to shepherd the sheep. They should be shepherding. And if they are refusing to say something that the congregation absolutely needs to hear, then they're not being a very good shepherd. I think that's just absolutely true. Now, what that means is it seems like in most cases, if a pastor refused to say something about Charlie Kirk and the assassination, we could make a couple of conclusions. And the conclusions that we could possibly reasonably come to is, one, he is a coward, because maybe many churches, this is a fact, are very politically diverse. And in many cases, no matter what happens, if it's an election, this happened to me in 2020. I was at a church that was very politically diverse. We weren't there for very long. And during the 2020 election, everybody was like upset, the Democrats and the Republicans. And, the Republicans were like, there's some fishy stuff is going on. And the Democrats were upset because it was closer than they would have liked. And they're like, all these insane Trump voters, they made this election too close, and it was tense, and we were worried all night. So even if you were in that kind of church, which I think is a really problematic kind of church, like churches should not be split on major, massive moral issues like the ones that we vote over in presidential elections. But if that kind of church exists, the pastor could have at the very least said something like, something comforting, or something like, hey, remember, everybody, keep your eyes on Jesus, or remember, don't be divisive, or, have love for your brothers and sisters, even if they disagree with you. Even if it were like a soft milquetoast kind of message, that he could have given to the congregation. Everybody was stressed out. Everybody was sad. And that was an opportunity for the pastor to pastor the congregation. And he absolutely refused to. And the reason is that I very quickly discovered was that he was a coward. He did not actually care about shepherding. It was a mega church, go figure. It was massive, one of the biggest churches in the area. And he was a coward. He never said hard truths. He didn't exposit the text. He focused on topical sermons that were just about really superficial issues. He never dived deeply into the Word of God. And so we didn't stick around that church for very long. But the point is, that is the kind of thing, that's the kind of opportunity that arises that a pastor should be looking for in order to shepherd his congregation well. Because if your entire church is struggling with bitterness, or if the vast majority of your church is struggling with worry, these could become sinful things. Bitterness and worry are sinful things, but if they're struggling with things that could become worry or bitterness, those are absolutely things that a pastor should be talking about, because he doesn't want his church to fall apart. I mean, ideally. He wants to be a good shepherd and shepherd his congregation well. Now, how does this apply to Charlie Kirk? I think there are 4 possible reasons that we need to consider. There's not just 2. A lot of us, I think, on the surface, we think of 2 options. But really, I think there's 4 options. If we maybe on the surface at the beginning, we think there's only 2 options for why a pastor would not talk about Charlie Kirk. Either he does talk about the assassination, and therefore he's brave, and he says the things that need to be said, and he loves truth. Or he doesn't talk about it, which means he hates truth, and he's a coward, and he's not saying the things that need to be said. Or he somehow agreed with it, and he is like, oh, he's got what's coming to him, which a lot of people think, which is pathetic and sad. But maybe he took that position, and so he didn't say anything. But really, and of course, obviously, if you're in the second option, that's not a good church. And if you're in not a good church, you should either do whatever you can to reform the church, or you should just leave, right? But really, I think there's 4 options that we should consider instead of just 2. It's not the 2, it's 4. I want to assert that it's possible that a pastor could refuse. We'll say this: a pastor could talk about the assassination of Charlie Kirk on Sunday. Let's go back and consider the original argument. If your pastor didn't talk about Charlie Kirk on Sunday, you should leave your church. Okay, that's the claim. So let's think about the possibilities here. If your pastor did talk about Charlie Kirk, you should stay at your church. That's what that implies. But let's consider the options. A pastor could potentially talk about Charlie Kirk because he loves truth. That option is true, because he loves truth, because he is saying the things that need to be said, that he wants to shepherd his congregation well. That can completely be true. The other option for why somebody would talk about Charlie Kirk is perhaps because they hate truth. There could be situations where somebody chooses to talk about Charlie Kirk because they're a coward. Not because they're brave, not because they're actually saying the things that their congregation needs to hear because they want to shepherd them well, but actually because they're a coward. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One example is if they are conservative, or if they profess to be conservative. A good example of this is a Candace Owens type of person, where they are using the assassination of a heroic figure in order to gain reputability. A lot of people who criticized Charlie Kirk tremendously, Nick Fuentes types, Candace Owens types, want to use this as an opportunity to gain reputation. And if they are doing that, if they are changing their worldview, or, well, really, they're not changing their worldview. They have exactly the same cowardly, pathetic worldview. But if they are changing their persona just to basically manipulate their followers, and even a pastor at a church could do this. A pastor at a church could be like, oh, I know the area that I live in, and I know what they want to hear. Not what they need to hear, but what they want to hear. It might be what they need to hear, but if the intent of the message is, I'm just going to say what I think they want to hear, which is what a lot of pastors do, the pastors who, the same kind of cowardly pastor who refuses to talk about the election back in 2020 because they don't want to upset people, is the same kind of coward who could potentially choose to talk about some event like that, also because they don't want to upset people, right? So I was also at a church where the church was very conservative, and the pastor was actually less conservative, and he would say the things that the congregation wanted to hear, and slowly he would kind of move them to the left. And so this is a real thing that happens in church. So it's possible that a pastor could talk about Charlie Kirk because they love church, or because they love truth. And it's also possible that a pastor could talk about the assassination of Charlie Kirk because they hate truth. Now, the same exact thing is true with the opposite. A pastor could not talk about Charlie Kirk. They could refuse to talk about the assassination and this national tragedy because they hate truth. This is the other obvious solution. A pastor might be a coward, or he might not be. He might recognize, this might offend some people if I say something true, so I'm not going to do that. Even though I think they need to hear it, and I think it would be valuable. And in reality, it really would be valuable, and these people need somebody to shepherd them. I'm going to refuse to say anything because I actually hate the truth, and I am not a good shepherd. That is a possibility. And that's the other obvious possibility that we think of. But there is a fourth possibility, and it is that it is possible that a pastor, and this is probably the hardest one for us to wrap our minds around, but I think they exist. And these are the people who we need to actually give grace to. It's possible that a pastor could not talk about Charlie Kirk actually because they love truth. And let me give you some possible reasons why. What if there's a church where the pastor, was seriously planning his sermon and he doesn't want to change it, and or he doesn't have the ability to change it because of how much time and effort he puts into the sermon, and he doesn't want to completely change the sermon because of something like this, but he thinks, I'm going to do it next week. I'm going to have a normal sermon today. The liturgy of the message is going to go exactly as usual, but I'm going to then talk about this later. I think that's totally reasonable. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think that is an opportunity still for the pastor to say something to the congregation in a moment where, like, this is one of the biggest national tragedies that's ever happened in our lifetimes. And everybody that I know in my circles was really torn up about this. And so I think that week would have been the right opportunity to say something. But I'm just saying it is morally acceptable for a pastor, even if they missed the right opportunity to do that, they could put it off till later and be like, well, because I actually love the Word of God and I don't want to denigrate my sermon in any way or preach the Word of God lesser, I'm going to spend more time to prepare a better message about this in the future. That's a totally rational possibility. It's also possible that there are so some of the examples that I'm thinking of, there are pastors who had very strong opinions, good opinions about the assassination and how tragic and horrible it was, but they kept their sermon focused on the Word of God alone. Now, I think it's entirely appropriate for sermons to have practical application, and if a pastor is refusing to actually apply the Word of God to the lives of the congregants, that's a problem. I've also been to churches where they They just focus on quote unquote preaching the word, and then they have no application whatsoever. And that church was also very politically diverse. So there, you can have a weak congregation if the pastor is topical and just focused on kind of, whatever I feel like talking about this week, and kind of avoiding the Bible. But you can actually also have a weak congregation if they quote unquote focus on the Bible, although I don't think they're focused on the Bible at all if they don't actually apply it properly. And then they don't apply it properly, and then the congregation is weak because they don't know what to do with this stuff that they're being given. Both of those are bad. And so there are some situations that I am thinking of where the pastor did not mention it in his sermon, but he has very strong opinions about the assassination, and they might just be like, I want to be faithful to the Word of God in the sermon that I prepared, and the sermon is a time to focus on the Word of God and not, random cultural events. Now, I think that's perhaps a little misguided, but I think that's completely a morally acceptable position. And so, all that to say is, there are 4 options that we should be considering in situations like this. Somebody can actually speak about Charlie Kirk because they're a coward, and they can refuse to talk about Charlie Kirk actually because they love truth. So, in other words, we need to give grace. We shouldn't just jump to the conclusion where it's like, this could possibly be a good church, but I listen to propaganda that I hear on the internet, and because I'm potentially at a very good church here, who the pastor really cares about truth. Now, those are rare, but if I'm at a really good church here where the pastor refused to talk about this, maybe I should have a conversation with him and figure out why. And then if I can discern that he really just didn't want to offend people, that's a bad church. You should confront the guy, or eventually you should leave and find a better church, because obviously that pastor has no interest in actually shepherding. But if you have a conversation with him and you determine that, maybe if he's misguided about it, if you would have done things differently, whatever, but it's possible that he could actually love truth and want to do this for a good reason. Again, even if you think it's misguided or not. That's something that we have to consider. Don't give in to the propaganda that we hear on the internet. And also realize, but the other thing I forgot to mention is there could be churches where the pastor does talk about the assassination, but they're coming at it from a leftist perspective, or they're coming at it from a perspective where it's like, I'm going to talk about Charlie Kirk, but also I'm going to say, well, he got what's coming to him, and they're wearing the rainbow robes, and they've got their congregations full of trans people, and so that church could also be talking about Charlie Kirk. And so when the quote-unquote conservative people are pushing like, if your pastor didn't talk about Charlie Kirk, you better leave your church. What about the church who is celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk? That's a good church because they talked about Charlie Kirk. They fit my silly little rule about what a good church is, when really we should be thinking about these things a little more deeply. I guess this is mainly a lesson in not giving into the surface level propaganda we hear on the internet. There's always a seed of truth in a lot of propaganda or in a lot of falsity that could very easily lead us astray, but we can't let that happen to ourselves, and usually we have to think more deeply than just surface level about this. Another thing here, this goes on, another thing that this could be used for is a pastor could be like, and this is more like the gaining reputation thing, like, I was one of those rare pastors that chose to talk about Charlie Kirk. This is happening too. And therefore, look at all these other bad churches as they beat their breasts saying, thank God I am not like these other people. Does that sound familiar? I think there was a Bible verse exactly like that, where they say, look at all these other pastors that I'm better than. You better come to my church. That's just selfishness. That's just to gain reputation, and that actually displays a hatred for truth instead of a love for truth. So think more deeply about these things, and you will do a lot better than if you just give in to random internet propaganda from people who want your clicks, and they're getting paid by you watching their videos and their podcasts, and they're saying things that rile you up and are what they think you want to hear instead of what you need to hear. Something to think about.